This is a world gone mad. This is a world gone mad. Mad, 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 mad.
It's another day in a world gone mad. I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. I'm back again to give my commentary on the news. So thank you for joining me. So let's talk about today's madness, and in no particular order, RFK Kennedy's CDC overhaul and vaccine chaos. Within the last 36 hours, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. dismissed all 17 members of the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices and replaced them with only 7 individuals after one declined, many of whom are known vaccine skeptics or have ties to anti-vaccine advocacy groups. Now, the restructuring broke long-standing protocols for expert review, sparked immediate backlash. The American Academy of Pediatrics refused to participate, citing an anti-science tone to the new members. Now, even Reuters highlights that insurers may reevaluate whether they'll cover vaccines endorsed by this reshaped panel, given that U.S. health plans rely on ACIP recommendations for coverage decisions. Now, at its first meeting, the new ACIP postponed votes on crucial updates like RSV antibody use and the combined MMRV for children, and even reopened debate on thimerosal, a preservative long deemed safe, triggering alarm among public health authorities. Now, with CDC staff sidelined and evidence-based process derailed, the panel's legitimacy is in question, creating a risk of fragmented guidance across states. Colorado has already approved alternate expert vaccine boards and disrupted insurance coverage. Experts warn this patchwork could lead to lower immunization rates, worsen the current measles outbreak, and undermine decades of trust in public health. Repetitive from me, but isn't it nice to know that RFK Jr. is in charge of the nation's health? Yes, sarcasm. Vaccines are in question. We may not even have access to them. My girlfriend and I were just discussing this, and we are incredulous that this is the man who decides life and death for the citizens of America. Trump at NATO summit, rebutting early intel on Iran strikes. Now, at the NATO summit in The Hague, President Trump ardently defended the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, comparing their effect to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and claiming they knocked them for a loop. He dismissed an early CIA and DIA report, labeling it inconclusive and fake news, and emphasized that further intelligence, including on-site evaluations, confirms the sites are obliterated, even as the initial leak suggested only a few months setback for Iran. Now, flanked by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who accused leaked sources of political motivation and launched an FBI inquiry into Trump aimed to discredit skepticism and reaffirm confidence in his military decision. Trump's robust defense of the strikes also served to reinforce the administration's broader diplomatic posture at NATO, endorsing unified defense commitments, announcing forthcoming U.S.-Iran talks next week, and positioning the U.S. as a decisive security guarantor. Now, meanwhile, leaks and conflicting narratives stirred concern. Opponents argue Trump's public denials undermine trust in intelligence institutions and risk discord within NATO, particularly as European allies grasp for clarity on the actual damage in Iran. Now, the clash over intelligence not only spotlights the credibility of U.S. agencies, but also raises questions about how much media leaks could influence public and international opinion during sensitive military diplomacy. I don't know who's right, but it's typical of Trump's bravado. Remember the biggest, the greatest in history, the most massive destruction, the largest amount of money raised, all the things Trump said in the past. So you be the judge whether he's accurate about the destruction of the nuclear facilities in Iran. Supreme Court allows large scale immigration transfers. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a 6-3 order allowing the Trump administration to resume deporting migrants to so-called third countries, nations other than their countries of origin, without providing prior notice or chance for them to challenge the transfers. Now, the decision stayed a lower court injunction that had required migrants to have a meaningful opportunity to raise fears of torture or persecution. Although the majority offered no detailed explanation for the ruling, liberal justices led by Sonia Sotomayor strongly dissented, warning the ruling exposed migrants to substantial grounds for torture or death and criticizing the court's move as an abuse of judicial power. Now, the judgment impacts real cases immediately. The administration had prepared to return 8 migrants, some convicted of violent offenses, to countries like South Sudan, despite one federal court keeping that specific ban in place for now. Now, immigration advocates argue the policy risks violating international human rights obligations, particularly under the UN Convention Against Torture, by enabling rapid deportations without due process. Now, while the government frames this as restoring executive flexibility to remove criminal non-citizens, legal experts caution that vulnerable migrants could be sent to unstable or dangerous environments without the opportunity to voice their concerns in court. That's right. Let's ship them out. Rollin', rollin', rollin'. Keep those doggies rollin'. Move 'em out. Head 'em out. Get 'em the hell out of our country. Way to go, Supreme Court. Trump's mega bill. What it is and why it's stalled. As July 4th looms, Senate GOP leaders are racing to piece together provisions extending Trump's 2017 tax cuts, adding new tax breaks for tips and overtime, and increasing spending on border security and defense while offsetting costs with deep Medicaid and SNAP cuts. However, internal divisions are mounting. Moderate senators like Susan Collins and Tom Tillis are pushing back on proposed Medicaid reductions and threats to rural hospitals, while conservatives such as Rand Paul and Ron Johnson demand even deeper cuts. On top of that, several key provisions were struck down by the Senate parliamentarian under the Byrd rule, requiring any reconciliation bill to focus strictly on budget matters, forcing significant rewrites and putting the July 4th target in doubt. Now, in response, President Trump has ramped up pressure, hosting a White House event with everyday Americans to sway wavering Republicans, warning legislators that no one goes on vacation until the bill is passed. Now, despite this show of force, some GOP senators remain wary of the bill's fiscal impact. The CBO projects it could add $2.4 to $2.8 trillion to the debt over a decade. Democrats have firmly pledged to oppose it, and the loss of even a few Republican votes could block the bill, especially if it can't clear the Byrd rule hurdles to proceed via reconciliation. Now, as it stands, the legislation is locked in a high-stakes crossfire of policy priorities, procedural constraints, and internal pressure, all under a fast-shrinking clock. So here comes the divisions within the Republican Party. Oh no! Some Republicans actually think there's something wrong with this big, beautiful bill? Ya think? Okay, I'm going to discuss the major pending U.S. Supreme Court cases for the summer of 2025. I'm going to tell you the case, what's still waiting for a ruling from the Supreme Court of the cases, and the ramifications of that ruling. First up, birthright, citizenship, and nationwide injunctions need to be decided. The Supreme Court is reviewing whether lower federal courts have the constitutional authority to issue nationwide injunctions that halt federal policies. In this case, Trump's 2025 executive order denying birthright citizenship to children of undocumented immigrants and temporary visa holders. Now, the key question is not the constitutional right to citizenship itself, but whether a single federal judge can impose nationwide blocks on executive actions. Now, the ramifications of this: a decision limiting such injunctions could weaken the judiciary's ability to quickly halt sweeping executive orders, creating a patchwork of enforcement across different jurisdictions. If the court preserves broad injunction powers, it reaffirms the court's role as a primary check on executive overreach. Another ruling that's up for the Supreme Court, Mahmoud versus Taylor, religious opt-outs in public schools. Now, in this case, the court will decide whether parents in public schools have the right to opt their children out of lessons involving LGBTQ plus themes based on their religious objections. The case stems from a Maryland school district that removed an opt-out policy for inclusive early grade storybooks, triggering legal actions from religious parents citing First Amendment protections. Now, ramifications. A ruling in favor of the parents would grant broader religious exemptions in public education, potentially complicating curriculum planning nationwide. On the other hand, siding with the school district could reinforce state and local authority to mandate inclusive education policies without religious carve-outs. Another thing waiting ruling from the Supreme Court, Landor versus Louisiana, religious rights of incarcerated individuals. Now, this case asks whether prisoners can sue individual correctional officers for monetary damages under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act for violations of religious rights. Lower courts are split on whether this permits personal liability or only injunctive relief. Now, the ramifications of the ruling from the court, a ruling allowing damages could force prisons to revise staff training and religious accommodation procedures. Denial of such claims would limit inmates' legal remedies to system-wide reforms and reduce personal accountability for prison staff accused of religious discrimination. Next up on the docket for the Supreme Court, Trump versus the AFGE, executive control over civil service jobs. This case involves an emergency appeal by the Biden administration to block Trump's reclassification of thousands of federal civil service jobs. Trump's executive action sought to strip employment protections from certain agency workers, effectively allowing mass firings or reassignments based on political loyalty or performance. The ramifications when the court rules, if the court upholds Trump's authority, future presidents could drastically reshape the federal workforce, potentially politicizing civil service jobs. A ruling against Trump would uphold long-standing protections and reinforce Congress's role in managing government employment structures. And finally, up on the docket, major ruling coming up for the Supreme Court, DHS deportation and Convention Against Torture compliance. The court is reviewing whether the Department of Homeland Security can deport asylum seekers to third countries where they credibly fear torture. We talked about this earlier, raising questions about compliance with the United Nations Convention Against Torture. The case emerged after lower courts blocked certain removals, arguing that asylum protections were being violated. Now, the ramifications ruling favoring the DHS could accelerate removals and reduce international protections for migrants. If the court blocks the deportations, it would strengthen U.S. obligations under international law and reinforce the rights of asylum seekers fleeing credible threats. And we saw that the court ruled 6-3 to allow mass deportations to take place by Trump. So, some obvious conservative rulings from the Supreme Court. Donald Trump criticizes Fed Chair Powell and eyes replacement. At a NATO press conference in The Hague on June 25th, President Trump launched a scathing attack on Fed Chair Jerome Powell, calling him an average mentally person, low IQ for what he does, and a very stupid person for refusing to lower interest rates amid his tariff-driven push to reduce U.S. debt expenses. Trump argues that high interest rates are inflating government borrowing costs, potentially adding hundreds of billions of dollars annually, and insists that Powell's resistance is a failure of economic leadership. Despite multiple insults, Trump claims he does not intend to remove Powell, before his current term ends in May 2026, a decision that requires Senate confirmation and is protected under Fed independence rulings. Continuing his critique of the central bank stance, Trump revealed he is vetting 3 or 4 potential candidates to succeed Powell after his term concludes. Among the rumored contenders are former federal Fed Governor Christopher Waller, Kevin Warsh, Kevin Hassett, and even Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, all viewed as more amenable to aggressive rate cuts. While Trump frames this as a strategic pivot to intellectually strong economic leadership, the moves have intensified debate about protecting the Fed's long-standing independence, underscored by a recent Supreme Court ruling that limits presidential control over the central bank. I am absolutely shocked. Trump doesn't like someone? He thinks that person has a low IQ and is inept? Never would I guessed this is how he would feel about Chairman Powell. Donald Trump, the one-note samba, keeps dancing on. Career Builder and Monster file for bankruptcy. On June 24, 2025, Career Builder and Monster, the twin titans of 1990s online recruiting, filed for Chapter 11 in Delaware nearly a year after their merger. Now, the combined company, now backed by Apollo and Randstad, reported $50 to $100 million in assets against a heavier $100 to $500 million in liabilities, citing a challenging macroeconomic environment and fierce competition from platforms like Indeed and LinkedIn. With subscriber bases shrinking and AI-driven recruitment turning job posting into volume rather than value, the company couldn't regain the network effect needed to thrive. As part of restructuring, Career Builder and Monster is selling its core operations in a court-supervised auction. Now, job board services are slated for acquisition by JobGet, while Monster's media sites, example military.com, fastweb.com, are set to go to Valnet, and government software services will be sold to ValSoft. The company is also obtaining a $20 million debtor in possession loan to maintain payroll and vendor payments. Analysts say the collapse of these once dominant platforms underscores a transformative shift. Recruitment is moving away from legacy job boards toward AI-powered relationship-driven hiring, and the survivors are those who innovate quickly. You know, I use these for jobs many times. I'm sure you have in the past. Amazing of something that was so normal is now going away due to AI. AI is not a factor in any other industry, is it? Yeah, okay. All right, let's get to my uplifting news story for this episode. Very interesting. Sleep trailer. 8 tiny pods bringing dignity and hope to Oregon's homeless. In Lebanon, Oregon, 39-year-old nonprofit leader Jason Christensen responded to a poignant question, why aren't we helping? So he answered that by building the Sleep Trailer. It's a mobile haven with 8 lockable pods, each equipped with privacy-protected windows, bedding, heating and cooling, and personal storage. Inspired by Capsule Hotel's clean designs and fueled by his $65,000 personal investment plus a bank loan, the trailer launched in early 2025 in partnership with Crossroads Communities. Now, over a 3-month pilot period, Sleep Trailer offered nightly shelter to 35 individuals, empowering 18 to transition into permanent housing, highlighting how simple solutions can catalyze real change. The real breakthrough of Sleep Trailer isn't just shelter, it's stability. Residents report their third night inside sparks hope and clarity for them. One man secured housing the final day of the pilot program. Another couple living in their car saved enough while sheltered to take steps for the future. The pods provide safety and structure. Guests sign agreements, respect quiet hours, and are checked in nightly. Local leaders say the trailer may not only save lives, it restores dignity, mental health, and momentum toward self-sufficiency. Jason said he plans to expand the model statewide, adding ADA accessible units, joining pods for families, and partnering with disaster response teams. What a very cool idea. And to hear about the restorative powers, mentally, emotionally, and physically, very powerful, these sleep trailers. I really hope they catch on not just statewide, but nationwide. You're listening to A World Gone Mad. I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. I'll be back again Friday with another episode, waiting to hear from you. And if I don't, then I'm sitting in a room talking to myself. Stay hopeful.
There is chaos in the world. Can't you see?